Um, as implied by my title, I'm aiming to start a conversation or advance our conversation on drainage. So reach out anytime with questions. But as I get started, I just want to acknowledge many people have helped inform this work, and this is really just a small number of the people who have been involved in the different projects that really I'll try to sum up today. So I'll also acknowledge some federal funding sources and lots of conversations with producers along the way. So the work I'll talk about today really starts with conversations with Water Security Agency now, I think about a decade ago, where they brought us into a room and said, drainage is something we're looking at, and we need to better understand the impacts of wetland drainage on, and they brought me into the room to talk about water quality, which was a really interesting area, and one that I've clearly been thinking about for about 10 years now. So before I dive in, I'll acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. And I will be talking about work that really spans all the treaty territories of the prairies, including Treaty 4 in particular. Now, I'll also acknowledge that I am trained as a water scientist, so I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about things that are a little bit different. And I'll acknowledge that what I understand best is the water science, and I work a lot with agricultural scientists, social scientists, and others to really help inform my thinking. But I'm not qualified to give you agronomic advice. I'm here to tell you about some of the trade-offs. And I have my U of S logo there in part to also acknowledge, I get a paycheck twice a month, whether or not it rains, and irrespective of things like tariffs. So I understand that I feel some parts of the system deeply and other parts and aspects of decision making aren't ones that impact my life directly. I'm one generation off farm, being that child of a mom who grew up on farm with seven older brothers. So there's aspects of the system that, of course, I am disconnected from. Now, as we talk about the Prairie region, there's so many common narratives of the region, right? Breadbasket of the world. Another one is duck factory for North America. And I'll just bring in a narrative that I think is important, which is it's arguably one of the least water secure parts of Canada. And I think that resonates with producers because we are so dependent on soil moisture and so vulnerable to soil moisture variation from year to year. And of course, today we'll focus on Saskatchewan, where I think most folks are, unless you're on holiday somewhere warm, which is incredibly important to Canada's cropland production. So today I'll take you through background on drainage, what I'm talking about by drainage and wetlands. I'll talk about a research approach called transdisciplinarity, which is what we've really tried to do here. And I'll take you through some of those outputs that range from a synthesis of all the science that we have to some new biophysical modeling work and then some social science to understand where we're at on drainage and drainage conversations. Then I'll touch very briefly on the new policy and talk about some of the things I'm thinking about as we move forward. So in terms of what drainage is, in the prairies, it's predominantly surface water drainage caused or facilitated by ditching to remove wetlands. So there is growing tile drainage, but it's a relatively small proportion and it's a bit different. So that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about drainage here. And I think it's important to recognize it's been part of prairie agriculture for more than a century. And people have argued that the prairies wouldn't be farmable if it wasn't for drainage. So it's, of course, increasing arable land, productivity, and efficiency. And the economics work we've seen has really shown there's a benefit to producers in the current context. Um, the other key point is that although drainage regulations existed, they were unenforced for decades, which left a situation where there were many, many kilometers of illegal drainage ditches, and there was growing issues of conflict related to drainage and flooding impacts. So the government set a goal of getting 80% of illegal drainage in compliance quite quickly, um, concurrent with goals to increase agricultural production in that area of the economy. So all of these factors and the economic benefits really led to a demand to expand drainage extent. So we do now have a new policy, and as I mentioned, I'll talk about that as we get to the end. But I think a key thing as we get started is this question of what's a wetland? And if I could reinvent the English language, I think I would create 9 words for wetlands because part of the challenge of what we're talking about is that these are really diverse ecosystems with diverse benefits and diverse impacts on producers. But when we use the word that we've got, which is wetland, what it means is we have waterlogged soils and there's distinct vegetation. Um, that includes wetlands that may only be water inundated or waterlogged for periods of weeks, but they all have really important ecological and hydrological functions. And as anyone who's driven the prairies or flown over the prairies knows, they're a defining feature of our landscape. You see them everywhere. Now, on the environmental science side, we can speak to a great number of benefits of wetlands. They're important to flood mitigation. They're really important to water quality control. They store vast amounts of carbon and sediments, of course, important wildlife habitat, contributing to recreation, tourism, as well as cultural uses. And then they have a role in groundwater recharge as well. But as I noted, it's a question of trade-offs. They are a cost or a nuisance or both to crop producers in particular. So when we talk about drainage, it leads to wetland loss pretty much by definition. Now, the rates of wetland loss in the prairies are high, and those numbers, particularly the numbers we're seeing fairly recently, are contested. So scientific estimates of wetland loss don't exist across the full scope of the prairies, but many people believe the numbers are high and higher than we're seeing currently reported. We know wetland conservation, and we still do have a lot of wetlands in the landscape. That's been driven by rules, incentives, and preferences. Um, as we look to the future of wetland conservation, conservation organizations and governments have argued there's not enough money in the bank to pay for incentives for wetland retention. There needs to be some voluntary conservation or rules-based conservation, is a conclusion in many circles as a path to support wetland retention. Now, stepping back to sort of what we've done as scientists in this realm, starting with those initial conversations on, what are the impacts of drainage, is we've embarked on what is called a transdisciplinary approach to research. So starting with questions of partners and engaging with a whole bunch of people in our research process to identify research questions and engage in the process, which is thought to help bridge different knowledge systems, have a greater impact on decision making, build trust, and make sure that the science is relevant to really what's needed today. So we took the questions of key partners and we worked to develop a multifaceted research program to understand management of agricultural wetlands and drainage, and really sort of the question that we tried to center on that came from all of these conversations was, what wetlands must we keep? So what are the wetlands, or how many wetlands do we need to maintain some of these key functions of our environment? So that meant we co-developed our program based on a whole lot of conversations, and really tried to commit to knowledge mobilization and outreach. So lots of conversation, including a film that you can see here. We started with really a science synthesis and associated infographics to try to keep that science as accessible as we could. and then move towards some new modeling to fill gaps in what we needed to know, and social science based on emerging evidence of conflict in this area. And we tried to follow an approach or a reflective approach to science, which is described in different loops of learning. So we initially started with taking questions other people had and saying, are these the right questions, or are we approaching them in the right way? The single loop. Then we move towards, are we learning the right things and infusing this learning into our research? And then I'll talk at the end a little bit about the triple loop, which is something that I think I've never reached in research before, but it's this question of how do we decide what is right and our role in science and policy for me. So as mentioned, one of the first questions we had was, what are the impacts? And to try to answer this, we really dove into all that we knew about the function of prairie environments and specifically wetlands. So key point here is we weren't taking learning from other landscapes that are governed by different biophysical factors. We were really trying to learn about research and what we know from the prairies specifically. And reasons that we needed to do this are probably clear to all who live in Saskatchewan and know our environment. But key things are most of our runoff occurs during snowmelt, which is a period of low infiltration, and plants really aren't a factor in hydrology at that time of year. And much of the landscape is naturally non-contributing. So those red blobs on the map up there in 2005 would have not contributed to flow in an average year. And really drainage is intended to change that dynamic. So key things we needed to consider were how runoff occurs, which is really through a fill and spill process in much of the landscape, where wetlands will fill up and then sequentially fill into the next area of the landscape, leading to what we describe as threshold-driven runoff, and making the number and size of wetlands a key control on what occurs in the landscape. So the science synthesis that we did really just dove into the literature of what we know. And what we found was with increased drainage, we will expect increases in watershed discharge volumes, and high flow events will become more frequent. So that's increasing flood events defined as 1 and 2 year events, or more like 1 and 100 year events, which are the ones that make the newspapers. But the impacts of drainage on flood frequency are going to depend on the structure of the landscape. So they're going to depend on, local contextual factors, as well as last year's precipitation, how full those wetlands are, and so on. But the key points are we expect an increase in discharge volume, an increase in flood frequency, and then this variable response, which means that place matters in terms of understanding those impacts. When we move on to the question that I started with, which was, what are the impacts of wetlands on nutrient export? Our conclusion was moderate to high certainty that drainage will increase or can increase nutrient export. And that word can is because in some years we don't have runoff, but on decadal scales, it will increase nutrient export. And that's because nutrient export is really governed by how much water is moving off the land. So that's the key factor. More water will be moving off the land, moving more nutrients. Or you can think about it as an increase in the size of watersheds, as well as we're losing some of the nutrient retention benefits of wetlands themselves. When we think about groundwater, we know that certain wetlands have an important role in groundwater recharge. So we can expect groundwater recharge to be impacted, but this again is a very place-based response. We also know, and this was an interesting piece that came out of, conversations and really starting to understand the system more deeply, this question of salt transport is also important as we think about impacts of drainage on downstream ecosystems, as well as lands that drainage waters will pass. Now, biodiversity is another key factor we consider in terms of drainage impacts, and I think this is the best known one, and it's one that's been known for quite a long time. We know that prairie wetlands are biodiversity hotspots, that phrase I mentioned, the duck factory of North America. And we know that the maximum biodiversity is supported by a mixture of wetland sizes and different permanences. Um, and that's because of the habitat complexity. So we usually like to think about managing wetland complexes to maximize some of these benefits. We know drainage has already had a significant impact on habitat, and that small, ephemeral, and temporary wetlands. So, the smaller edge of the spectrum are the most impacted by drainage, and those are keystone habitats. In particular, this time of year, in a couple weeks' time, as the landscape starts to thaw and migrations hit full force, they're really important habitat and food source early in the year. So we know that drainage will have an impact on biodiversity. And then the last one is carbon and greenhouse gas budgets. This is a really interesting one. We know wetlands are incredibly important sites of carbon storage, and that drainage and farming of these wetlands impacts that carbon storage. We also know wetlands emit greenhouse gases naturally. So this net balance is a really tricky one to understand. The conclusion we came to is there's certainly evidence that we will impact this benefit or this balance, but then the full effects really are ones we don't have scientific answers for yet. And I just will add this note that I think there's a lot of rapidly evolving science on this that's really interesting, suggests potentially very important carbon implications. That I think we'll have to keep tabs on pretty closely. So in terms of what we know about drainage from that synthesis exercise, we know that the effects of drainage are going to be varied and complex across our landscape. And those responses vary depending on how many wetlands you have, how much drainage will occur, the slope of your land, and so on. And some of these effects can be mitigated or partially mitigated by things like flow management practices. But as we, aim to really move that water off the landscape and into downstream water bodies, some of those impacts are ones that will simply occur. But that's a discussion of the impacts. We know there are economic benefits to drainage. We know there are practical benefits to drainage. So there's a lot to consider. And I think, the key point, if nothing else comes out of my talk, is we should really be okay to talk about them. I drove to work today, that has an impact. I will eat lunch today, that has an impact. So everything we do has impacts. And we need to be able to talk about, those benefits and those impacts of different elements of our decision making. So knowing that there was a demand to understand sort of what acceptable limits are for drainage, or understand a bit more deeply how drainage impacts these different areas of the environment, we embarked on biophysical modeling. And basically, we used hydrological models that were built for this environment. And we built in the different factors that we could, which wasn't everything that I've talked about. Some of the science just isn't there yet in terms of allowing us to model it. But this allowed us to get at the hydrological effects and some of the other effects in terms of biodiversity and water quality in more detail. So here, we used what we call a virtual basin approach. So we tried to define an average basin in the prairies to get a behavioral response that should inform roughly how many catchments or how many watersheds will respond to drainage impacts. Now, it would be far better to have modeled all of the basins of the prairies and have a really deep understanding, but this is where we're at in terms of just not having the science to fully understand the impacts that we're looking at. So the plot on the top is just annual precipitation, recognizing it's a very variable environment that we live in. Median year is your first vertical bar here, and then a wet year and a dry year. So if we just look at annual runoff volumes, we see in an average year, the yellow line, a very significant increase in annual runoff associated with drainage impacts. So you can get to 10% and perhaps not a big impact, but you see that impact certainly grow as drainage advances. And as you look at a really wet year, you see a greater impact of drainage. So again, that's taking a virtual landscape, overlaying removal of those wetlands in different ways to look at the average response in terms of annual runoff across median years and wet years. And then, of course, in dry years, often we have very little runoff, and those effects of drainage are more muted. So I can point you to individual citations and different areas to look more deeply at pieces you're interested in here. Now, we took that hydrological basis and we looked more deeply at some of the endpoints that we manage our environment for. So as we advanced drainage in the landscape, you can look at this from 0% drainage or natural wetland cover to 100% drainage. And of course, that means that we're losing water storage in wetland ponds, which makes sense. That's what we're doing. Now I'll just orient you to these graphs because we'll use them a fair bit. All of these data points are years. So this is a dry period and this would be a wet period. And this just reflects the tremendous variation we see from year to year in our environment. So as we drain more wetland area, we lose pond storage. That makes sense. What does that mean to return period flows, which is one way of talking about flood risk? Well, what we see is as we advance our drainage, we tend to get larger flood events. And that also aligns very much with our hydrological understanding and different, smaller scale assessments of drainage impacts. When we move to thinking about total phosphorus export, and this is really sort of one of my major areas of work, is understanding phosphorus export from the landscape because that's one of the primary stressors impacting lake ecosystems. We see functionally the same response, and that's because this is driven by discharge. So our modeling approach will underestimate the drainage impacts on phosphorus export and water quality because we've really modeled them based only on that flow effect. So we expect to see an increase in total phosphorus export as we drain the landscape. And you can sort of look to the middle of the plot for where we expect the policy to take us. So a pretty substantial impact on phosphorus export from an average landscape. And then, of course, as we think about biodiversity impacts, we see a response of different indicators, so breeding ducks, wetland-associated birds, to drainage. So this is perhaps the most sensitive indicator we've looked at, where we see even at low extensive drainage, pretty significant population drops. Riparian area is another indicator we use because that's important habitat, and that again shows that as we advance drainage, we're losing substantial amounts of riparian habitats. So this is just an infographic of those impacts of drainage that we expect to see as a function of the pond area drained. Now, moving on to the social science insights, and I think these are perhaps among the most important findings. We embarked on this work knowing that there was evidence of conflict escalation in rural environments on drainage-related issues. So we used interviews, site tours, community meetings, different approaches to try to understand the system and what was going on. We worked mostly in 3 drainage networks, and we use this tool, which you can see in the top right-hand corner, called fuzzy cognitive maps, to try to define how people see the system as working. and also get their narratives about the values of wetlands and conflict-related issues in the landscape. Now, it's kind of a nice moment to say this was several years back, so I hope the situation has improved, although I'm not sure it has. Now, the most important finding is there are divergent perspectives on the value of wetlands, and I think this is not a surprise to anyone who lives in the prairies. And we had comments like, to me, wetlands is a swear word. I don't use it very often. Or the word didn't exist until Ducks Unlimited came along. And Ducks came up as an organization that faced a fair bit of critique through these interviews. We also see comments like, we're critical because all we see is these farmers draining wetlands, but they don't care about water quality to their neighbor or the habitat being lost. So we see divergent perspectives on multiple sides of the issue. And what we started to think we saw was almost different worlds of thinking, or water worlds, where, for example, some people believe in a state-based bureaucracy. They wanted to see policy and enforcements to balance trade-offs. We see people who believe strongly in conservation. They think the land is best when it's left alone to be as it was. And then the production water world, where people see it as a working landscape, where primary goals are production, and people are really the key to managing that water and mitigating any risks in the landscape. And as we use this tool, these fuzzy cognitive maps, to try to understand how people see the system, we saw tremendous differences. So the map on the left kind of makes me laugh because it shows, the challenges of an academic scientist in communicating, because their brains are full of connections and complexity. But that map shows a whole lot of interaction and a highly dynamic system associated with drainage impacts. The producer fuzzy cognitive map on the right is an interesting one as well, because it shows a very different focus on the economics, the crop production, but it does not show an impact of drainage on many of the things that scientists are suggesting exist. Now, there's a tremendous variability in these maps, and these are two counterpoints, but certainly through all of our conversations, we see this science-based understanding of drainage being contested. We also, so comments like, I do honestly believe the downstream effects of producer drainage are grossly exaggerated. At the same time, we see people saying people are losing their homes, they're losing their farmyards and their buildings and their cropland because of what's happening upstream. So again, lots of conflict in the landscape. We saw that the policy process, and again, this was to about 5 years ago, and the governance of drainage have contributed to this conflict. Factors like disempowerment, exclusion, and very significant power differentials associated with conflict escalation. We had many people raise concerns about lobbying, conflicts of interest, and then a lot of concern and conversation about trade-offs, private benefits, and public costs, or public benefits and private costs, depending on how that's framed. And I think the key concern is there's evidence of conflict escalation and increased polarization. So we heard lots of narratives of heroes, victims, and villains. So evidence of alienation, which will undermine any efforts to resolve conflict. But we also saw that sometimes the conflict was deeply rooted, related to relationships and history more so than resources. And there are a couple quotes here that relate to, conflicts that may go back to elementary school, or even, one person's grandpa stealing another person's grandpa's girlfriend, and long-term family feuds. The last quote I'll just read, he was complaining about land that he had felt was affected by illegal drainage, but everybody in this project does illegal drainage. This particular complaint had more to do with history than anything else. So questions about why people are concerned, that history, the complaint process, all sorts of pieces of the puzzle here. On a more positive note, we found that framing as a wicked problem helps us understand where we're at. And this idea of a wicked problem is one that um, is deeply embedded in sustainability science and a lot of resource management that really says some problems can't be solved because they're so deep and with so many different attributes, different understandings, different symptoms, causes, and they're always changing. And I think drainage is one of those. You know, people don't understand it the same way. We don't use the same definitions. We have a varied landscape. There's no single solution. And a key factor is it crosses scales and boundaries, right? So at the scale of, you know, a small parcel of land, the impacts are one thing. At a watershed scale, they may be very different. If you're upstream or downstream, that'll have very different impacts. So this framing as a wicked problem, I think, is helpful to help navigate good conversation on this issue. I'll also say, as you know, trained as a natural scientist, it's been an important moment to reflect on the roles of science. We saw science being used to contest or to empower or disempower, and certainly heard concern about the importance of local knowledge and how that's included. So things like meeting with a producer and them bringing out their data, their folder of photos and GPS data and so on, saying, be careful with that. No one will listen to me without that. As I mentioned, there was concern about objectivity, you know, calling some of the science out there as slanted. And then a question that I think was universal was inclusion and exclusion. A great many people felt excluded from decisions or the policy process. You know, this comment, heck, we're lucky if we get asked to participate at all, is one that actually resonates with me as well. So lots of questions about who gets to engage in the decision making. In terms of observations, transdisciplinary science is seen as this panacea in my area of work, and it's seen as helping bridge understandings and understand where differences lie. But what I've learned is it's not a panacea to work in conflict-prone, polarized environments. I think it's helpful, but it can't do everything. And the key is, you know, there's an incredible amount of capacity needed to really bridge understandings and build trust and respect. And I don't think there's an actor in the system, you know, an organization, a group, able or willing to meet this need at this moment. We see the importance of power differentials and politics in driving decisions and conflict and impacting polarization. And what I learned is that access to science and scientists can impact power differentials, which is really important. So we need to reflect on sort of this role of science in decision making, and I think we see this across politics all over the place. But narratives of evidence and best available science are being rejected or contested to ensure one's own standing. So this is important to be mindful of, particularly in conflict-prone situations. Now, I inserted a blank slide here because I don't have a segue to get to where I'm going next, which is sort of our current policy context. So it's like a pause button. Here's what I know of the new policy, and I'm sure there are others who are on the call who will know more about the new policy than I do. But functionally, there is a new policy advanced by Water Security Agency on drainage that sets wetland retention goals and will allow drainage of about 40 to 60% of wetlands from historic levels. They've included consideration of localized impacts and some special considerations around areas of particular concern. But this is a pretty significant amount of drainage that will be expected to advance based on that biophysical modeling I showed you earlier. So this is where I sort of look and think, you know, there's no single right path. It's a wicked problem and it is a balancing act. And I think one of the key things is we've got to be open to discuss these balances, these benefits of trade-offs and risks associated with drainage. And as we consider the economics, remember that there is a whole lot at play here beyond the field scale economics. So I'm looking for the right image to really articulate how I see the system. It's like a multi-dimensional teeter-totter. I got a four-way, but it's like a circle um, where, we need to find just the right balance of the system. And it's incredibly challenging because of so many factors that are being managed, spatial variability, and of course, really important differences in people's values and goals for this system. Research-wise, I'd say we've made it to that triple loop, reflecting on how to decide what's right. And some of those questions about the role of science really reflect my thinking, and some of the areas that I remain troubled on this one. We did sort of seeing how this situation was evolving and the science was evolving, advance one last piece of research on this, which was working on expert elicited scenarios to understand what do we think this landscape could be like in 2050. And those will be out soon, but the key thing that we saw was the only two scenarios people saw as credible were associated with low regulation environments. And that was sort of an agricultural as usual environment, one that I think most people on the call would probably be pretty happy with. Manageable climate change impacts, chugging along the trajectory we're on. The other one was an unmitigated climate change scenario, just defined as a crisis scenario, or my deepest, darkest fears is what one participant said. But I think the key factor is that there was this convergence on low regulation as the only credible future. And one person said, Saskatchewan doesn't have the political will or capacity to enforce retention and restoration of wetlands in agricultural areas. So functionally, there's little or no social license to regulate on this issue. And that, I think, resonates with me based on the conversations that I've had and many people in terms of how we see the system advancing. So for me in my area of work, that means I need to think about those impacts on water quality, how to mitigate those if that's what the goal will be, or how to adapt to those circumstances. So for me, what I'm thinking about more is source water protection, which as folks in Saskatchewan, when I teach on source water protection, one of the really critical case studies is Battleford. And we need to get back to source water protection and really think about source water protection to manage different constituents that were than were a concern in North Battleford, but are relevant to drinking water safety at all scales, like salinity, like organic carbon that can lead to carcinogenic disinfection byproducts, and then like bloom risk, which is certainly a concern across most prairie lakes. When I think about my own next steps, I come from a place where the lakes are crystal clear and have moved to sort of this green state. I'm now in the prairies, and I think, naturally would have been in this green state and are much more in this blue-green state associated with a variety of impacts we're having on the system. So this is a key management question of how do we adapt to or mitigate these circumstances of really deteriorated water quality. And of course, the answer, can partially come back to BMPs, but we know this from Lake Winnipeg as well, where there's been a lot of work. A lot of BMPs aren't effective in our landscape and really can't do enough to protect the lakes. So that's led to the advice widespread across the prairies of keeping water on the land, and that's clearly not the direction we're going. So I think 4R needs to be our major focus as we look at water quality, as well as looking at drinking water and probably engineering-based solutions, which can be expensive to deal with some of these issues. We've been working on variability in soil P, how to manage that variability for maximum agronomic benefit as well as environmental benefit, and had a workshop several years back where I really do want to get back to some of those recommendations and science next steps where I think we can achieve benefits for both environment and agronomics. But I think coming back to sort of that idea of a wicked problem, on water quality, where we're at is really defined by this slide. I love this image on the left because you can't see what I worry about. It's a field scale budget of phosphorus inputs, and it shows you, inputs and outputs on an annual basis. And the purple line is runoff. So the purple line you can't see in most years because it's so small because the fields are well managed. But the key thing is the small amount of phosphorus that's running off is more than enough to have these impacts on lakes. So this was a recent experiment we've done where we saw that you can induce blooms in the matter of less than a summer on this tiny amount of phosphorus coming into the lake. So that's why we are where we are. It's a problem of lakes being way too sensitive to these inputs of nutrients from the landscape. But that's where we are in terms of managing our water resources. So things I'm thinking about are whether we can reconsider this question of what is the right balance. Are we able to pull soil phosphorus down a little bit more to have a benefit to water quality? And can we do that without impacting crop production? So I think there's a lot to think about there in terms of water quality. So to sum up, pretty broad-ranging talk, and I think hopefully opening up conversation and just the fact that we need to talk about impacts, and impacts need to be seen as okay because, this is how the system is evolved. All of our actions have impacts. But what I've learned is that this interdisciplinary work at the edge of water and food, I think it's really important, but it's also really challenging. And this work on complex or even wicked problems requires a whole lot of humility. It requires cooperation, listening, and a pretty thick skin. I see drainage, as I mentioned, as a super complicated balancing act. In our landscape, it's so challenging because our landscape is so variable from place to place and also from year to year. So we need to manage the landscape for resilience and for multiple needs. So recognizing these areas of concern and working to mitigate them, I think is, that's a goal that hopefully many people can agree to. So ultimately, my argument is we need pragmatic, workable solutions for both land and water. And to have those, I think we need lots more conversation. So with that, I am happy to take questions. And if I can, I will see if I can unshare my screen and I'll paste some of the references I talked about in case folks want to dive in more deeply. Or, pop me an email and I'm happy to try to find a chance to chat or answer questions.
Thank you so much for that. Definitely a tricky area of research. Yeah, and I mean it's not just the land versus the water, but it's the um, different bodies that you have to go through. No, not just farmers. It's land reclamation. It's the environment. It's ministries. It's the whole nine yards. So very interesting topic for sure. First question, what are the typical drainage systems? Does the water typically flow into the nearest rivers?
Yeah, so this is where they're engineered to flow into an adequate outlet, which could be a river, it could be a lake. The policy, so far as I understand it, manages at sort of that micro watershed scale. So making sure that you're not going to cause erosion or localized flooding, but not at the larger scale.
And then, yes, definitely there was a question here about getting access to research discussed, especially given that some might not be open access.
Yeah, and I think I can only share that with the panelists, but I did create a little Google Doc with links. Some of them may not be open access. You're right. I can email those to you or see if I can figure out. They should be open access by now, so it's a question of finding the right link. So happy to help navigate that. Pop me an email.
With your current research, what do you envision as the future of farm-based wetlands in prairies or other agricultural regions? Do you foresee scaling this model to the other areas facing similar nutrient runoff issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I'll take the nutrient runoff piece and I'll do that second. I think in terms of um, research and management of wetlands, one of the key things we see is some wetlands have a disproportionately important impact on things like flow and flood risk, as well as nutrient export. And we call those wetlands gatekeepers. They're often larger wetlands lower in the landscape. So if I were to define a policy, I would consider those wetlands specifically because they can have a disproportionate benefit and lesser impact. There's other approaches argued out there like linear wetlands, where we could have higher wetland retention in the landscape if we just kept the ones that lined up and weren't such a nuisance. So there's a lot of different ways to think about that approach, but I think, the policy is out. There's a lot of interest in drainage. So this, I see this as advancing, and the key thing is getting ready for those impacts in terms of flooding risk, infrastructure risk, drinking water risk, and other factors. In terms of the nutrient side of this story, I think what I'll say is I really appreciate people are interested in this and really want to look for solutions. Being someone who studies environmental impacts of ag largely, it's really heartening to have great partnerships and people really engaged in, how can we look at this? How can we manage this? So I think key things are, where can we hold back water in a pragmatic way that, has acceptable but not too serious impacts on agriculture? And, the fundamental question of if we're only getting agronomic benefit of our current phosphorus recommendations in certain years, if we drew that back a little bit, we'd get benefits. And I think we're, decades away from changing any recommendation, but it would be great to start the work to look at, what is that right rate if we do balance that environmental side of the water quality risks. And I think, that environmental side of the water quality risks, we're really getting a strong understanding of why the prairies are different and why they're so sensitive, and why they, need a different management approach to some other parts of the world.
What kind of deterrents exist for getting compensation from a farmer whose land surrounds another farm pond, where the pond has been permanently altered, contaminated from drainage? This includes the fact that the pond no longer has its normal flushing from heavy runoffs events like spring.
Great question. I don't know the answer. I sort of know, more from news stories where you have to pay, you can't contest drainage on certain grounds anymore, and so on. So, my pragmatic answer is call Water Security Agency, but I don't know that there's a high likelihood of addressing that issue currently.
Has anyone looked at the costs that could have been mitigated in the 2013 Calgary flood? If less wetlands had been drained between Canmore and Calgary, the damages occurred could have been drastically reduced.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and that's one where I would need to sort of look at that in more detail to be able to speak to that. Interestingly, I think that watershed, the answer will be perhaps there'd be some benefits, but lesser than when we think about prairie watersheds, where wetlands are more important, I think, to the runoff dynamics and in part because the drainage is so much more extensive. So my sense is it would be different flood events where in the prairies where those impacts would be more significant and the economics would be quite substantial. I'm not aware of work on that. Certainly there has been work on Smith Creek associated with drainage impacts and some of the economics. And I think it's a really important consideration. I think it's also worth noting, we see the news stories of the very extreme flood events, and those are a concern, obviously. And they will change, but it's the medium ones and the medium to severe ones where we expect the biggest change, and those also have very significant impacts. Things like road infrastructure is something that people can relate to, where I would have concerns about possible impacts. If things are engineered to an adequate outlet, hopefully it's all good. But, as we look at watersheds aggregating into larger rivers and so on, making sure the systems are engineered to manage those changing water flows will be critical.
What is the benchmark of historic levels, and have we reached that goal already?
The benchmark of historical levels of
It's not specified, so if
I
we aren't
might.
sure, yeah, we can move on because it's not really specified for which levels we're talking. But Jason Stewart's asking, how about having some sort of mobile water treatment units that can pull up to lakes and pull the phosphorus out of the water, much like some water treatment plants and the making of crystal green struvite?
Yeah, great question. And it's interesting because often I put up a slide about lake treatment, because there is growing work on sort of geoengineering of lakes, which is incredibly costly, but in some cases it's the best option we've got. In the prairies, it's not a good option because our watersheds are so big and our lakes are so shallow, it'd be incredibly costly. The methods you mentioned, there are things like if we had a gatekeeper wetland, we could potentially use an approach like that, and pull phosphorus out of that water that will likely spill downstream eventually. So that could have a benefit. The challenges we face are water moves in spring where it's hard to do that kind of work and get out there, and then it's an incredible cost. So the economics of managing phosphorus once it gets into the water aren't good.
So it was clarified here. So what's the benchmark of historic drainage levels, and have
Mm.
we reached that goal already?
The benchmark of, so I would say this is the area I alluded to as being contested. The Water Security Agency numbers, I think they say we have 86% of historic wetlands. This is an area where I'm not an expert, so I can tell you the narrative I hear, but it's not my expertise. But certainly there are critiques of those numbers from water security, and some scientists would argue that we have already drained the 40 to 60% that would be permitted under the policy, but I assume the policy refers to the water security numbers. So that's an area where, I would expect more science to come out and sort of interrogate the different methods and differences among them. But that's a really critical sort of question as we look to go forward in some ways. And then in other ways, we have what we have and we understand the system based on what we have. So maybe, maybe today's wetland coverage is what we need to be thinking about and managing. I don't know.
And that kind of flows into this next one of what are your thoughts then on the recent report published by the Water Security Agency highlighting the amount of drainage that has occurred within the province?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I can get myself in a lot of trouble. My best understanding of the science is that there are issues in the approach and how it is communicated. And I think it was unfortunate to sort of go to a billboards across, I drove to Manitoba as the billboards were in every small community, and it's a lot more nuanced than can be presented in, an 8-word sentence. I do, part of the sentence I think was around, producers being stewards of the land, and I believe that, and I believe all are doing their best and, making good decisions, but 86% retention is not the number that I hear is credible.
Thank you for the insightful presentation, Helen. You mentioned that phosphorus losses to runoff are typically small, but they can still accumulate over time. Could you explain more about the processes that lead to these small phosphorus losses and how wetlands help mitigate those losses, especially when dealing with the particulate and dissolved forms of phosphorus?
Yeah. So key thing is, on an agronomic basis, those losses of phosphorus are tiny, right? They don't matter. And I often edit people's sentences that say phosphorus is not mobile in the soils because agronomically it may not be mobile. It doesn't matter to producers' balance sheets, but environmentally it's mobile. So it's those tiny, tiny amounts, and it doesn't need to aggregate year to year. It's, that tiny amount that moves is enough to really strongly impact a lake. So it's an incredibly challenging situation. And part of it is because a few things. One is that snowmelt transport. So we often have higher phosphorus in the surface soils where the water is going to move during snowmelt, as well as the plant residues release a fair bit of phosphorus. And that's how the system works. That's how it is. But it means that those surface soils and that phosphorus in them is critically important, as well as the plant residues. When we get to wetlands, the key role of wetlands in that is holding water back, right? So by having more wetlands in the landscape, less water flows downstream, and all of that water is going to have phosphorus. So when we think about how much phosphorus reaches a lake, the biggest thing controlling that is how much water reaches the lake. Wetlands also, trap sediments, which we see. I think most folks will know, the soils in wetlands are different. And that's because of that trapping function and some of the, biological functions of wetlands. So they can hold that wetland or that phosphorus in the wetland, which means as we connect them, it'll release some of that phosphorus back out. And that's something, we have some understanding of, but not a lot. But it means that, the numbers I showed you about phosphorus impacts will underestimate because we're releasing a lot of trapped phosphorus that was held in those wetlands that we're now draining as well. So not just the flow impacts, but also losing that wetland phosphorus trap.
Just a comment here that thanks so much for this very important transdisciplinary presentation. Science, environment, agriculture, people, politics, very challenging for policy and management. Could you risk rank the regulatory requirements to focus on the drainage applications associated to rivers, large wetlands, and lakes?
Risk rank? Can you repeat that for me?
Yes. Could you risk rank the regulatory requirements to focus on the drainage applications associated to rivers, large wetlands, and lakes?
I'm going to do my best to answer this one, and I'm also going to tell you I don't know enough about the regulatory requirements and what goes into a drainage application. Some of that is too distant from my day-to-day. In terms of the risks that I see as really important at a small scale, the policy is designed around managing erosion and trying to limit flooding effects on other people. I think the risks that I see are, as mentioned, water quality risks, and some of those on drinking water we really haven't looked at, and that bothers me because we have poor drinking water quality and need a lot of engineering to get, poor source water quality in most of the prairies when we're using surface water sources, which means we need a lot of engineering and money to get to good levels. So in terms of risks, I see risks of flooding associated with larger scale impacts once we get past that micro watershed scale. And then sort of this idea of cumulative effects in the landscape. We've got a lot of drainages going into different places. As that happens, what are the flow effects? How does that affect our flow management? And so on. And I know some of the Capel drainage thresholds will be a little lower in response to some of those concerns we've raised. but we really haven't had any system-wise assessment of what those impacts will be. And we all know from, questions about the Calgary flood, from all the floods that we've seen as people who live in the prairies, those events are really, really costly economically and in human terms, in terms of, just the stress.
Okay. So what was the effect of climate change on wetlands?
Yeah, such a great question. As we think about climate change impacts in the prairies, key thing is our environments can become more variable. So wet years wetter, dry years drier, and that impacts wetland habitat, but they're also pretty resilient to wet and dry periods. So on the whole, I think we will expect a loss. Well, we will expect a loss of wetland habitat associated with climate change plus drainage. But a key thing is the plots I showed you were based on historic variation, so multiple decades of weather data. As we move to a warmer climate, what we expect is the highs to get higher and the lows to get lower in terms of all of those plots. So we should expect a more variable landscape in terms of those impacts that we'll be looking at.
Okay. So thanks for the presentation, Helen. I know this is a difficult topic, but I'm curious as to why Saskatchewan does not mirror a wetland drainage policy similar to Alberta or Manitoba. Do you see major problems in regards to their policies in other provinces that would not work here in Saskatchewan?
That's a great question. I think there was a wish for a fair bit of drainage to advance associated with goals to increase agricultural productivity. I don't see, any barrier to the wetland policies of Manitoba or Alberta being applied here, except for the politics. And perhaps, this wish for a made in Saskatchewan solution, although I think as we think about made in Saskatchewan solutions, we also need to learn across jurisdictions about impacts. And, I did present some of this work in Europe and was sort of greeted by shock as they invest tens of millions of dollars to restore wetlands and also ask questions about, the carbon impacts and what that means to trade and so on. So um, I think in many ways it's a pragmatic decision, really to increase agricultural productivity that wasn't seen as well balanced in the Manitoba or Alberta policies. I assume that's why we've gone this route.
Well, we're at 10:40, so there are still a few more questions there, but we are going to go to oh, I guess we could do one more. We have 10:45 here. So if you're okay with that.
Yep.
Okay, so are there situations where BMP to prevent phosphorus runoff are good in one local wetland and where they're a problem in another wetland?
That's a great question. I mean, I think BMPs within wetlands are an area we just haven't really looked at, right? So, could a BMP to retain phosphorus in a wetland impact waterfowl? Maybe, but we need to look at that. I think the key thing is as we look at BMPs in wetlands, there's tremendous variability in wetlands and how important they are to phosphorus export and how their hydrology works. So, I would start by thinking about those gatekeeper big wetlands and whether, some sort of phosphorus trapping technology might help mitigate drainage upstream. But functionally, the science isn't there to really inform us about trade-offs. And we'd be making decisions sort of based on expert advice, local knowledge, but not a detailed science assessment of those practices at this stage.
Does the wetland drainage discussion include the topic of irrigation and salinity movement in the surface water and impacts of downstream water quality or soil quality?
Yeah, this is a really, really important one. And I think it's actually one better handled by your discipline than mine. For sure, we know some of the areas being drained have very significant salinity, and that salinity will be expected to move. So what are the impacts of that? I don't think we know. If it's staying to the ditches, perhaps that doesn't matter a whole lot. Once it reaches downstream ecosystems, it will have an impact. And that's an incredibly complex next layer to understanding the impacts. But on the whole, that would be seen as a negative to the water quality and possibly sort of exacerbate some of the impacts that we'll already anticipate. But I'll just reiterate that salinity in the landscape is so variable, and it is really important. So that's an area that it would be great to see more assessment of those impacts.
Okay. On the level of a producer, are you seeing online misinformation, disinformation impacting decision making regarding wetland drainage in Saskatchewan?
Yes. Yeah, that's one of my biggest concerns. And I don't know, I mean, when I talk about the triple loop and what is my place, that's one area that really troubles me because I don't want to get into arguments with people. But I don't know whose role it is to call out disinformation and misinformation. Perhaps it is mine. But I do see that, and it is a very deep concern of mine.
We can probably shoot in one more question here. How does hydrological connectivity influence phosphorus mobilization in prairie pothole watersheds?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So that sort of red map that I showed earlier was at a very large scale. But I think, so in my discipline, we have a few fundamental rules. And one is the size of the watershed is proportional to the amount of nutrient loading. So if you have a really big watershed, you have a more nutrient-rich lake. Pretty fundamental. So by increasing watershed connectivity, we're increasing watershed size, increases the flow volumes, increases the phosphorus, increases the nutrient loading.
Definitely lots to think about. And as we start to get a lot more of these disciplines intertwining, it's great to see that, we're all coming from the same background of science-based knowledge and trying to learn more. So thank you so much, Dr. Helen, for presenting and broadening our horizons on this topic.